Chapter 1. The Heritage. The mind of the South, which has been conspicuous for its resistance to the spiritual disintegration of the modern world, is traditional in the sense that it exhibits important connections with European civilization. The habit of contemporary publicity has been to treat it in terms of superficial contrasts, and to ignore the fact that it rests upon conceptions more fundamental in human nature than those envisaged by certain modern philosophies. Like the being contemplated by Aristotle, the Southern tradition has a fourfold root. The most obvious of these is the feudal theory of society, which, although a transplantation from the Old World, appeared in the South so natural a principle of organization that the Southern people have not to this day been persuaded to abandon it. Another is the Code of Chivalry, a romantic idealism closely related to Christianity, which makes honor the guiding principle of conduct. Connected with this is the ancient concept of the gentleman, first presented by Aristotle and passed down through Castiglione, Sir Thomas Eliot, and others. It significantly presupposes a stable social order and a system of class education. Finally, there is a religiousness, difficult of explication because, having little relation to creeds, it stands close to the historic religiousness of humanity. It is, briefly, a sense of the inscrutable, which leaves man convinced of the existence of supernatural intelligence and power, and leads him to the acceptance of life as a mystery. All of these existed as determining forces in the antebellum South, and are discernible in the peculiar complex of Southern culture today. 1. The Feudal System. The South developed as an agricultural region through the institution of a feudal system. The type of society which it created was patterned on an order then declining in Europe, but in the New World, it grew to notable proportions, modified by features of land and climate, and especially by the presence of Negro slavery. The impulse behind it was both economic and political. A large estate under central management and worked by laborers who were bound to their station proved the best means of acquiring wealth from the soil of Virginia, and settlers here, as in the other southern colonies, had come primarily to make their fortunes. From the incorrigible gentlemen idlers of whom Captain John Smith complained in his dispatches to England, to the host of indentured servants who poured into the settlements in the 18th century, dwellers in the South aspired to acquire estates and become masters. And though many did not progress beyond the status of yeomen or small farmers, the plantation ideal was dominant in the general ordering of Southern life. Politically, the feudal structure was desirable because by making the owner of broad acres true lord of the domain, it simplified administration. Lord Baltimore recognized this when in Maryland he offered manorial powers to those able to take up large holdings. Some 70 estates were granted on such terms and were run more or less in the fashion of an English medieval manor until in the course of time they turned into its American counterpart, the Southern plantation. The number of truly baronial estates was indeed never great. In many inland districts, and especially toward the mountains, they were lacking, but in Tidewater, Virginia, in the coastal regions of the Carolinas, in the lower Mississippi Valley, and in the bluegrass region of Kentucky, they were numerous enough to be thought of as the characteristic economic organization, and to support a society which produced the first Americans popularly identified as gentlemen. The structure of the plantation mirrored the structure of the entire Southern social world. Its organization demanded stations, and the stations which men held in their local community bred in them a peculiar pride and dignity, which came to be associated, not always favorably, with Southern character. The method of its operation, moreover, enables one to understand why anything other than a class society was unthinkable to the Southerner of the old regime. In the social order which was overthrown by the Civil War, there existed a feature of feudalism incomprehensible to the modern mind, with its egotism and enlightened selfishness, subordination without envy, and superiority without fear. This was made possible, as is always true, by an articulation. The typical plantation was a little cosmos in which things were arranged by a well-understood principle giving coherence to the whole. Even those estates which grew a single staple for the export trade and depended on foreign sources for their manufactured goods had slaves and servants trained in special occupations. Large estates had a great representation of trades and skills. When King Carter of Carrotaman devised his will in 1726, he listed 17 indentured servants among the personnel of the homestead, including sailors, tailors, and carpenters, a glazier, a bricklayer, and a blacksmith. A later member of the Carter clan, Robert, the master of Nominee Hall, counted among his slaves 11 carpenters, 2 joiners, 2 postilions, a bricklayer, a blacksmith, a miller, a tanner, a shoemaker, a hatter, a sailor, a carter, a butcher, a cook, a waiter, and a scullion from the men. And from the women 3 housemaids, 2 seamstresses, 2 spinners, a laundress, a nursemaid, and a midwife. Mount Vernon, under the administration of George Washington, displayed a comparable diversity of occupations. When he received title to the estate, it amounted to 2,500 acres, which he, as a land-loving Virginian, eventually increased to more than 8,000. In his operations, the owner availed himself of the labor of both free and indentured whites, in addition to that of a considerable number of slaves. From the indentured whites, he usually expected some form of specialized service. In 1760, he wrote to Philadelphia for a joiner, a bricklayer, and a gardener. In 1786, he purchased the services of a Dutchman who was to serve as ditcher and mower, and in the same year he got, from on board the brig Anna from Ireland, 2 servant men, Thomas Ryan, a shoemaker, and Cavan Bower, a tailor redemptioners for 3 years' service by indenture. His slaves included waiters, cooks, drivers and stablers, smiths, wagoners, carpenters, spinners, knitters, a carter, and a stockkeeper. With his hired labourers he commonly drew up a contract which allowed them a house, a stated amount of provisions, and which sometimes placed restrictions on their moral conduct. General John Mason, son of George Mason of Gunston Hall, has testified regarding that division of labour which made each plantation a relatively self-sufficient community. It was much the practice with gentlemen of slave and landed estates, so to organize them as to have considerable resources within themselves, and to employ and pay but few tradesmen, and to buy little or none of the coarse stuffs used by them. Thus my father had among his slaves carpenters, coopers, sawyers, blacksmiths, tanners, curriers, shoemakers, spinners, weavers, and knitters, and even a distiller. A fine glimpse of a feudal paradise which survived until 1865 is given by Mrs. Virginia Clay in her Belle of the Fifties. During the closing months of the Civil War, she spent some time at Redcliffe, the magnificent estate of James H. Hammond of South Carolina, who had contributed the chapter Slavery in the Light of Political Science to the Southern Symposium, Cotton is King, and Pro-Slavery Arguments. On this spacious property, tilled by the labor of 400 slaves, were a gristmill, a forge, a wheelwright's shop, a hospital, and a church, to which there was summoned once a month a white preacher to give the Negroes a somewhat more decorous introduction to Christianity than could be expected from one of their own emotional exhorters. Redcliffe grew not only cotton, but also corn, wool, vegetables, and grapes. In the palatial residence were marbles, statuary, and paintings, so that this plantation measures up even to the romancer's conception of the antebellum slaveholder's estate. With such diversity of occupation, there was a task adapted to everyone, and when a worker grew too old for a certain kind of employment, he would be shifted in paternalistic fashion to another better suited to his condition. The strong sense of particularism, which developed in these communities, derived principally from the circumstance that everyone had his place. The feeling of being bound to a locality which has been almost wholly lost by the deracinated population of the modern metropolis was a part of the plantation dweller's daily consciousness and an important factor in his self-respect. In the midst of traffic in human beings, there was paradoxically less evidence of the cash nexus than in the marts of free labor, and even the humble could have the deep human satisfaction that comes of being cherished for what one is. Between the expression "our people," euphemistic though it may have been, and the modern abstraction manpower lies a measure of our decline in humanity. As the plantation freed its members in large part from dependence on institutions outside its bounds, it encouraged an intense provincialism. The lords of these agrarian strongholds regarded foreign influences, and the expression must be taken in its most provincial sense, as undesirable. John Pendleton Kennedy's Swallow Barn, which presents the most complete plantation setting in early American literature, gives a good notion of this distrust. Here Frank Meriwether is the benevolent despot. A portly Virginia gentleman of 45, he had studied law at Richmond more to learn how to defend his own rights than to represent clients before the bar, and then had retired to his estate to enjoy as a birthright the finest existence a man could conceive. He managed accounts, dispensed hospitality in traditional open-handed style, made himself court of high appeal to override the decisions of overseers, and took a distant interest in politics, exploding now and then over some novelty of invention which threatened to disturb the calm of his Eden. He saw in the steamboat a menace to isolated communities and a forward step toward that consolidationism at which Southern statesmen were to point for the next 50 years. "This annihilation of space, sir, is not to be desired," he told his visitor from the north. "Our protection against the evils of consolidation consists in the very obstacles to an intercourse." He felt that the home material of Virginia was never so good as when the roads were at their worst. Swallow Barn is little dependent on the outside world, even for amusements. Its wholesome fun comes from annual celebrations, droll incidents, and the kind of interest which humane people naturally take in one another. With the protection of this seclusion, the hierarchy stood firm. From the owner of the estate at the top, down to field workers, bond or indentured, who, if not bound to the soil, were at least under some constraint to work it, the ranks were plain. The master, as justice of the peace, preserved order and settled disputes. In actual practice, he usually possessed more authority than the title or office he held would imply, for his power extended beyond the sphere of business and legal relationships. Though sometimes in practice an autocrat, as John R. Thompson of the Southern Literary Messenger described him, he usually took pride in exercising his power with justice, and he ordinarily acknowledged a responsibility for the welfare of his dependents which proceeded from moral obligation. Under the owner was the overseer, a sort of lieutenant, who for his subsistence and a moderate wage assumed the direction of planting and harvesting, made the innumerable decisions which wind and weather force upon an agriculturist, and most difficult of all, disciplined the slaves. The overseer was assisted by a driver, who was often chosen from among the more capable and reliable Negroes. He generally worked as foreman, but sometimes he was given the responsibility of assigning tasks to the other slaves and even of administering punishment. The upper-class Southerner developed a notion that only gentlemen were entitled to stand at the head of this hierarchy. Only those habituated to self-restraint and brought up in the proper sentiments could wield a degree of authority so terrifying in the abstract. Perhaps experience with overseers from the North encouraged the idea that Yankees lacked the requisite qualities. At any rate, a writer in the Southern Literary Messenger contended that Northerners were unfit to be masters. "In obedience to isothermal laws," he said, "slavery has already made its exodus from the inhospitable shores of New England, never to return. There is no climate there is no soil there, and there is no master there." Years later, Ellen Glasgow was to make Major Lightfoot in the battleground say contemptuously of the low-caste Rainy Day Jones, "There's no man alive that shall question the divine right of slavery in my presence, but it is an institution for gentlemen." Although some slave owners were not gentlemen, there was moral truth in the observation that only under the rule of gentlemen was the peculiar institution tolerable. The noblesse oblige of the plantation owner has been made so prominent a part of the Romantic tradition that it might be regarded with suspicion were it not well supported by the records. Washington, for example, who was far from a sentimentalist on the subject of slavery, was accustomed to visit his sick slaves and on occasion to take over personal supervision of their treatment. The spectacle of this typical landowner riding daily about Mount Vernon, which he had divided into 5 farms, each under the management of an overseer, and all under the authority of a single steward, keeping a sharp eye on operations and often reprimanding underlings somewhat impatiently, furnishes a striking picture of this paternalistic social structure. The sense of trusteeship thus developed has been one of the enduring legacies of the plantation system. The landholder, if he belonged to the tradition, would not concede that his servants meant nothing more to him than the value of their labor, nor did the servant ordinarily envisage the master as nothing more than a source of employment. The master expected of his servants loyalty, the servants of the master interest and protection. Each working in his sphere went to make up a whole, through which there ran a common bond of feeling. It was a type of the cooperative society, held together by sentiments which do not survive a money economy. At this date, it seems a condition of primal innocence before the disintegration of society into competitive and envious groups, kept at peace by a state which must grow more and more powerful to intimidate them. This is the spirit of feudalism in its optative aspect. Some abuses were inevitable, and in the South, lordship over an alien and primitive race had less favorable effects upon the character of the slave owners. It made them arrogant and impatient, and it filled them with boundless self-assurance. Even the children, noting the deference paid to their elders by the servants, began at an early age to take on airs of command. After an extensive tour through the southern states, J.S. Buckingham expressed the opinion that slavery trains the free child in the constant exercise of arbitrary power over his little slave companions. It makes him impatient of contradiction from any source, as he is always accustomed to command. And it engenders such a habit of quick resentment and instant retaliation for an injury, real or supposed, by the frequent opportunities of its indulgence on unresisting and helpless slaves, that at length it forms a part of the individual's nature, and can neither be conquered nor restrained. From this came the universal irritability of temper, impatience of contradiction, and constant readiness to avenge every imaginary insult with instant and deadly punishment of the offender. Horace Fulkerson, who had studied the life of the lower Mississippi Valley, described the planters as arbitrary, self-willed, and dictatorial, so that even from their equals they could illy brook contradiction and opposition. These traits, which were almost invariably noted by Northerners and by visiting Englishmen, gave Southerners a reputation away from home which they thought baseless and inspired by malice. Another factor, present in agrarian psychology everywhere, and especially strong in the Southern planter, was the desire for a lasting identification of the family name with a piece of land. He had a profound conviction that a family is not established until it belongs to a place, that a local habitation and a name go together. And it can scarcely be doubted that this coupling of the name with the property was an attempt to regain that connection between the land and its possessor, by which the owners become, politically as well as economically, the estates of the realm. John S. Wise mentions no fewer than 17 Virginia families of the upper James River Valley whose names were thus identified with estates. In this way, the American patrician sought to gain some of the prestige enjoyed by the county families of England. He liked to be alluded to as the proprietor of such and such a hall, for in the South generally, freeholding of itself conferred some kind of superiority in the quality of citizenship. Landless men lacked dignity, and commercial pursuits were traditionally discountenanced. Thomas Nelson Page makes Mr. Gray, on riding off to the war from which he knows he may not return, leave a parting injunction with his son. "And Jacqueline," he said, "keep the old place. Make any sacrifice to do that. Landholding is one of the safeguards of a gentry. Our people for 6 generations have never sold an acre, and I never knew a man who sold land that throve." And in George W. Cable's John March Southerner, the old judge says to his son proudly, "We never sold an acre, but we never held one back in a spirit of land speculation, you understand?" Together with the land hunger of the Southern planter, the desire to retain and augment the patrimony, well illustrated in the careers of Colonel William Byrd, of George Washington, and of many others, there was a vague but ever-present sense of personal relationship to the land. The Virginia or Carolina aristocrat wanted not merely another piece of soil as good as his own, or a sum of money equal to its fair purchase price. He wanted his land in the same way that a patriot wants his country. To call this mystical would perhaps explain little, but it may safely be said that this sense of local attachment, of loyalty to the land, is a sentiment to which all people are susceptible, and that it is sure to be found in landholders, small or great, of long establishment. An understanding of this bond goes far to explain why the Southerner chose to battle for his acre, which more often than not was only a poor red acre, rather than for some abstract concept of union, about which warm sympathies could not cluster. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who understood better than any other writer of his time the contrary workings of the human heart, took note of this in his pertinent essay, chiefly about war matters, when he remarked that a state was as large a territory as anyone could be expected to love, and that love for an invisible hypothesis like the American Union was something few people had the imagination to achieve. The relative self-sufficiency of the plantation, the noblesse oblige of its proprietor, the social distinctions among those who dwelled upon it, which had the effect of creating respect and loyalty instead of envy and hatred, the sense of kinship with the soil, present too in its humbler inhabitants, who felt pangs on leaving the old place. These were the supports of southern feudalism, which outlasted every feudal system of Europe except the Russian, until it was destroyed by war and revolution. It possessed stability, an indispensable condition for positive values. It maintained society in the only true sense of the term, for it had structure and articulation, and it made possible a personal world in which people were known by their names and their histories. It was a rooted culture which viewed with dismay the anonymity and the social indifference of urban man. 2. The Code of Chivalry. A part of the Southern heritage which deserves more attention of the serious kind than it has received is expressed by the term chivalry. Modern spite against all assumptions of superiority has assigned it a comic role. Actually, it was an institution of strong and, on the whole, good influence. Since chivalry has been one of the main traditions of European civilization, it was not strange that a chivalric code should develop in the South, which was disposed to accept rather than to reject European institutions. In Europe during the Middle Ages, it had existed as a body of forms and sentiments of enormous power in elevating and refining civilization. It appears to have had its origin in the dark years following the dissolution of Charlemagne's empire, when cruelty, rapine, and brutal anarchy so distressed men that there came a passionate reaction which enlisted men in the service of an ideal good, and later found a sanction in the Christian religion. The people recognized a class of knights as representatives of right and defenders of order, idealized them, crowned them with all virtues, both real and imaginary, and for 500 years respected them as the ruling caste. Although in its later period chivalry became associated with other things, including the worship of woman, it commenced thus as an order of men of goodwill, pledged to make might serve right, and although it developed forms, ceremonials, and shows, it was first and foremost a spirit. Of this spirit, the Knights of the Round Table are perfect if legendary exemplars, engaged in asserting a rule of justice and humanity against naked strength. Candidates for the order of knighthood were given an initiation which made these duties explicit. An early specimen of the vow required of them was to speak the truth, to succor the helpless, and never to turn back from an enemy. The ethical importance of chivalry lay in the fact that where this spirit made itself felt, there it alleviated, even though it could not entirely overcome, the natural brutishness of man. It furnished a standard by which iniquity could be condemned, however dazzling the success of its perpetrators, and in the darkest times stood as an aspiration and a promise that justice would return and lawful relations obtain among men. In the New World, even more than in Europe, it existed as a spirit, little seen in rituals and ceremonies, but often of surprising influence in determining conduct. It is difficult to say in precisely what company it crossed the Atlantic. That a certain portion of Virginia's first settlers were gentlemen is acknowledged. Captain John Smith's struggles with his indolent colonists, who were 10 times more fit to spoil a commonwealth than either to begin one or but help to maintain one, form a striking episode of early American history, and there can be little doubt that these misplaced men about town would have been happier deciding points of honor than digging stumps. Like some other European institutions, chivalry came over a seedling, but having struck root in the American soil, achieved a lush growth, though modified, sometimes grotesquely, by the rudeness of the American environment. Its recruits were from a well-established middle class, and it is probably true that the spirit of chivalry was stronger in the southern states after 200 years of settlement than when the Virginia and Carolina landholders were first clearing their acres. Of the characteristic ideas of chivalry, none came to a more exaggerated flowering in the South than that of personal honor. In the Old World, chivalry supported a caste, the distinguishing mark of which was an honor that was to be preserved at all costs. In the South, as soon as the gentleman caste had established itself on property ownership and slave labor, this concept was invoked to set it apart from the commonality. The gentleman was surrounded with prerogatives. He could not be injured with impunity. His motives could not be impugned, and above all, his word could not be questioned. A highly touchy sense of personal pride was built on these premises, and its vindication often called for the duel, a recognized institution in America from colonial days. In the Revolutionary period, dueling was fairly common in the North, but it began to disappear there after 1800. In the South, on the contrary, it continued to flourish, and the toll of life exacted by this rigid convention was so great that in 1858, Governor John Lyde Wilson of South Carolina published a pamphlet, The Code of Honor, or Rules for the Government of Principals and Seconds in Dueling. The purpose of this manual was not to encourage the practice, as could be supposed, but rather to diminish it by defining rather narrowly the grounds on which one gentleman might demand satisfaction of another. The author announced it his desire to save lives, which might be lost as a result of challenges made on insufficient grounds. It is easy to see, however, that he retained pride in the institution. Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, and South Carolina, he observed, would bear away the palm for gentility among the states of the Union, if the prevalence of dueling should be admitted as a criterion. At the same time, Northern criticism of the practice piqued him. He contrasted the urbanity of Southerners with the uncouth civility of the people of Massachusetts, and he intimated that the kind of personal abuse which found its way into Northern journals would in the South bring challenges to mortal combat. Elsewhere, opposition to dueling was attributed to the materialistic Puritan skeptics of this country, and anti-dueling laws were described as transplanted from the pernicious hotbed of Puritan skepticism. Curious memorials of this once widespread custom survive today. Tennessee requires of all those admitted to the bar an oath that they will not engage in dueling, and governors of Kentucky must swear upon induction into office that they have never fought a duel with a deadly weapon. Another aspect of the Code Duello, which removes further question of its origin in the spirit of chivalry, was the emphasis placed upon the social rank of the combatants. A gentleman might chastise a low fellow with whip or cane for offering him an insult, but he could not, according to the code, meet him on the field of honor, because honor was the exclusive possession of the gentleman caste. Governor Wilson noted in his code that if a man received a challenge from a person with whom he was unacquainted, he might demand a reasonable length of time to ascertain his standing in society unless he is fully vouched for by his friend. In the days of European chivalry, knights jousted only with knights, and sometimes this privilege was insisted upon even on the field of battle. It is recorded that at Bouvier, a body of Flemish knights refused to charge a force of infantry because they were not gentlemen, and so lost the battle. Because the object of a knight's career was that honor which proceeds from feats of arms, it naturally followed that he was expected to be indifferent towards material rewards. And there seems little doubt that the contempt directed at money-getting, as well as the belief that money itself is somehow contaminating, originated with this high and solemn ideal, colored as it was with Christian self-denial. Though the attitude was not, of course, carried over unaltered into the American South, there were unmistakable reflections of it. Here the people had come to the New World for the purpose of gathering fortunes, a fact which could not be denied, but which was kept out of sight in various ways. Southern landholders exhibited an aversion to the handling of money, except perhaps at the gaming table. It seemed more in keeping with the haut monde for them to have their business transacted through a factor. To this agent, the planter consigned his crop, together with a list of his plantation's requirements, including articles of luxury. The factor sold the produce, forwarded the supplies, and so left his client free from all business duties, except a periodical settlement. In this way, many contrived to live as if they had no ties whatever with the world of money economy. Reference was often made to the point that money was a topic which men of good breeding never mentioned at the table. Such views, combined with the inveterate Southern habit of extravagance, created a type not far removed from the aristocratic wastrels of Europe, incapable of making money by personal effort, but unable to see why it should not be forthcoming to support their elegant mode of life. Like the knight of old, the gentleman was required to speak the truth, and it could be said that the Southern code made a fetish of the pledged word. Falsehood, like an act of cowardice, was supposed to lose one his standing in society, and the convention was enforced with considerable rigor by public opinion. If a gentleman's word was questioned, he demanded an explanation, And then, if the matter could not be adjusted, he proved that honorable status was dearer to him than life by going through the ritual of the duel. Only if he met this supreme test was he judged worthy of the companionship of gentlemen, or, in the language of knighthood, was he deserving of a place in the chivalric order? In antebellum days there was much vague allusion to chivalry, but it remained for the Civil War to provide an interesting commentary on the extent to which this spirit distinguished the southern people from their northern adversaries. The difference came out very sharp in the respective attitudes towards war. The southern people as a whole possessed a highly romanticized picture of the ordeal, which the businesslike methods of Grant and Sherman only partly effaced. They regarded it as an elaborate ceremonial, to be conducted strictly according to rules, and with maximum display, color, and daring. In other words, as a gigantic tournament with the Lord of Hosts for umpire and judge. Some Southerners actually expressed the opinion after First Manassas that the war would promptly cease because this battle had decided the question of manhood between the two sections, and there was nothing else to be settled. If the people of the North ever subscribed to this notion, they changed it after the removal of the colorful McClellan, and thereafter the task of conquering the South became a business, an official transaction, which cost a great deal more in dollars and men than had been anticipated, but which was at length accomplished by the systematic marshalling of equipment and numbers. John Pope's Virginia campaign gave the South its first intimation that the North was committed to a total war. The Southern people became dismayed by this, for it seemed an infraction of that tacit agreement obtaining among all civilized belligerents. Perhaps it is not too fanciful to read in Lee's terse statement, "Pope must be suppressed," a feeling that he was fighting not so much against a particular enemy as against an outlawed mode of warfare. And when Sherman, Sheridan, and Hunter began their systematic ravaging and punishing of civilians, it seemed to the South that one of the fundamental supports of civilization was being knocked out, and that warfare was being thrown back to the naked savagery from which religion and the spirit of chivalry had painfully raised it in the Middle Ages. The courtly conduct of Lee and his fellow officers to the farm wives of Pennsylvania has perhaps been sentimentalized, but the fact remains that these men felt they were obeying a code which is never more needful than in war, when fear and anger are likely to blind men and to destroy their self-control. The material loss in farms and dwellings has been forgotten, nor does the South today appear greatly to resent its economic inferiority. But the memory of how the Great March was conducted lingers on in bitterness. It is not unreasonable to suppose that the Southerner, a prodigal by temperament, has been able to accept the material loss without being able to accept the affront to the tradition by which he was brought up. In any case, the South has persisted in making a distinction among McClellan, Hancock, and Grant, who adhered rather strictly to the code, and such fighting prophets as Sherman, who inaugurated the war of unlimited aggression. The former, it was generally held, had fought honestly according to the rules of warfare, eschewing vandalism and terrorism. Naturally, the thought of being beaten came hard to a people priding themselves on their martial traditions, but the memory which rankled in the South for generations was that the enemy, while masking himself under pretensions of moral superiority, had dropped the code of civilization and won in a dishonorable manner. Today we have gone so far in the direction of nihilism that this attitude seems difficult to credit, but one has only to read the literature of Reconstruction to find it expressed frequently and with conviction. Against Meade, who fatally dashed Southern hopes at Gettysburg; against Grant, who won decisive victories at Vicksburg and at Chattanooga; or against Thomas, who at Nashville gave the Confederacy its most humiliating defeat of the war, one finds little or no complaint. But against Sherman, who admitted that of the $100 million of destruction his armies wrought in Georgia, only $20 million were of military advantage, words could not contain the measure of Southern indignation. Likewise in New Orleans, resentment against the alleged peculations of Benjamin Butler was as nothing compared with the outrage felt over his famous edict to the ladies, which according to the Southern code of the time was beyond the pale. A vehement Southern partisan was to declare after the war that the Southern people pride themselves so on their reputation for chivalry, they were willing to sacrifice everything in preference to it, including the hope of victory. Such feeling characterized the aristocratic class, and in this case the exceptions would seem to sustain the rule. Those southern commanders who advocated the other style of warfare and who, if they had got into the north with independent commands, might have followed policies analogous to those of Sherman and Sheridan, were not members of the gentleman caste, but were hard, self-made men who believed simply that war means fighting and fighting means killing. Of this group were Stonewall Jackson and Nathan Bedford Forrest, both men of the people, and both men in whom there ran a streak of ruthlessness. Those who more completely abjured the chivalric rules of warfare won. The military ritual which had come down from the Middle Ages was dealt a fatal blow, and the way was cleared for modernism with its stringency, its abstractionism, and its impatience with sentimental restraints. It scarcely needs pointing out that from the military policies of Sherman and Sheridan, there lies but an easy step to the modern conception of total war, the greatest threat to our civilization since its founding. Even if the Southern feeling of superiority in this matter rested upon facts supposed rather than real, it would have to be taken into account as one of the points of sectional friction. More than one observer viewed the Civil War as ultimately a clash of character, and the South naturally preferred to see itself clothed in the armor of chivalry. We may note, for example, a significant interview which took place between Captain Fitzgerald Ross of the Austrian Hussars and Judah P. Benjamin, Confederate Secretary of War. Captain Ross mentioned that on his journey to Richmond he had seen many evidences of depredation by the enemy, whereupon the Secretary replied, "If they had behaved differently, if they had come against us observing strict discipline, protecting women and children, respecting private property, and proclaiming as their only object the putting down of armed resistance to the federal government, we should have found it perhaps more difficult to prevail against them. But they could not help showing their cruelty and rapacity. They could not dissemble their true nature, which is the real cause of this war. If they had been capable of acting otherwise, they would not have been Yankees, and we should never have quarreled with them." Benjamin was expressing the predominant Southern view. Perhaps the tradition of chivalry led to excesses of its own, but they were not of the grosser sort, and it performed the inestimable service of keeping an ideal of nobility before the people. Few would wish to see the duel restored, or the precious sense of pride which made issues of small misunderstandings. On the other hand, our civilization has suffered no more grievous loss than the disappearance of generosity toward the weak and the vanquished. With the claim to exclusive right by an individual or a nation, expressing itself in the arrogant formula of unconditional surrender, the spiritual community of men dissolves, and we are at the threshold where everything is swallowed up in power. The pattern of chivalry, however, had other effects on Southern culture which must be pointed out. It definitely tended to discourage art and letters. The barrier which it raised against persons from lower social levels was less serious than that which it set up against the scholar and the creative thinker, and even the Southern conception of education was influenced by its ideals. Knights are performers of the jests, only rarely are they singers of them. The poets and troubadours of Europe, who made them live in story, had an uncertain position. They enjoyed some license, and they were valued for their special contributions, but the attitude of society toward them was one of tolerance rather than serious respect. And in that transplanted chivalry which grew up on American shores, one finds a comparable attitude, even somewhat accentuated by the rawness and philistinism of a new country. For although it is true that only a fraction of the populace belonged to that class, all aspiration was in its direction. There were no centers of commercial or intellectual activity in which competing ideals could emerge, and no other pattern was consciously followed. The situation of Southern men of letters points to the broader truth that in every aristocracy the artist tends to be déclassé. He has often been patronized and supported by the aristocrats, but the patronage and support have only symbolized the gulf between him, a supernumerary, a hireling, and those who have laid title to estates by deeds or by inheritance. This truth is not weakened by the fact that members of the aristocracy have themselves dabbled in art and letters. In instances they have done so to the extent of winning more illustrious names by these than by their rank. But it will be found virtually without exception that they have regarded such employments as elegant exercises, to be pursued for diversion, or to be exhibited as evidence of versatility. The notion of following letters as a profession was quite as foreign to the Southern gentleman as it was to the English nobleman, and his position was, if anything, less favourable for it. His career was that of a man of the world. His education was devised to meet its demands, and if he developed some special skill at authorship, that was a matter for congratulation. But seldom was there a suggestion that he capitalize it by making it his means of support, or his claim to recognition by society. This aristocratic prejudice, which had its foundation in the institution of chivalry, determined the content of Southern education and made inevitable the slightness and sterility of the Southern contribution to belles lettres. 3. The education of the gentleman. When in 1828 John Randolph of Roanoke, answering Edward Everett in the House of Representatives, called the ability to lead men, whether in the field or in the Senate chamber, the highest of the gifts of heaven, he was expressing the prevailing belief of his Southern compatriots. There is, he said, with the bitter implication of which he was a master, a class of men who possess great learning combined with inveterate professional habits, and who are, ipso facto, or perhaps I should say ipsis factis, for I must speak accurately as I speak before a professor, disqualified for any but secondary parts anywhere, even in the cabinet. It was natural that a people whose talent lay almost wholly in the direction of statecraft should consider eminence in war and eloquence in council the marks of illustrious manhood. The Southerner of good class was Aristotle's political animal. His antecedents were auspicious for leadership. His education prepared him for it, and before the 19th century was in its second quarter, the exigencies of his situation created a continuous demand for its exertion. Many explanations have been offered to account for the poor showing of the Old South in literature, but not enough has been said of the section's actual achievements in terms of its animating ideals. The climate, the lack of cities, the institution of slavery, all have been mentioned as militating against authorship, but inspection will reveal that the Old South wrote fairly prolifically, and that in the field which it had marked out for its own, it held preeminence for close to a century. The Old South was an aristocracy whose hero was the warrior statesman, and because it was intensely interested in the battle for political supremacy, its literature was the literature of the forum. It is a maxim that in every society education will ultimately serve the needs of the dominant class, and in the South this consisted of gentlemen planters who contemplated lives of ease and independence. The plantation system, with its patriarchal administration and the presence of slavery, which drove a wedge between the leisure class and those compelled to toil for a living, kept at the top of society a small group whose immediate tasks called for duties of a political nature. The Southern planter, although his ancestors might have been tradesmen or yeomen, became, once he had perfected his material establishment in America, an aristocrat by calling, upon whom there devolved the work of keeping harmonious the efforts of a stratified and fairly complex community. The question of noble lineage, which usually gets much attention, becomes largely irrelevant when it is understood that, once in the New World, these settlers created and maintained a class society. By the beginning of the 18th century, the populace was effectually divided into a lower class of slaves and tenants, a middle class of yeomen or small independent farmers, and an upper class of planters. The aristocracy of the Old South was small in number, and it was found in restricted areas. But such is the nature of aristocracy that if it is genuine, and that means if it earns and receives respect, its relative number is of little importance. It will set the tone of society, and those who aspire to rise in the world will seek to identify themselves with it. Though the number of antebellum mansions may soon be counted, it is nonetheless true that those who dwelled in them put their stamp upon the whole of Southern society, not excluding the turbulent frontier. Virginia, where this system lay in happiest balance, became the spearhead of the American Revolution and gave to the infant republic a wealth of leadership such as might have graced the golden age of another nation. The names of her sons comprise a veritable Plutarchian list of heroes. Patrick Henry, one of the most eloquent of Americans and a man of prophetic vision. Washington, whose firm and sagacious mind prevented the collapse of the colonial rebellion. Jefferson, cosmopolitan and bold political thinker. Madison, political journalist and learned student of constitutional history. John Marshall, the legislative judge, who carried far the fateful impulse toward consolidation, and John Taylor of Caroline, farmer-philosopher, whose searching critique of economic society anticipated the assumptions of Marxism. These were the chief figures in that constellation of genius which emerged from the agrarian feudal society of colonial Virginia, and who, joined with a few from other states, confirmed the South in the habit of governing. Their comparative superiority invites attention to the system of education which prepared them. The Southern ideal of education rested on those traditional principles which may be traced to Aristotle by way of the Elizabethans. Because it was designed to produce the well-rounded gentleman, its basic features are fairly easy to distinguish. Education beyond the most elementary, it was believed, is adapted only to those whose minds are previously disposed to the virtuous and the honorable, in other words, to an aristocracy. It is not adapted to the masses, who appreciate only the utilitarian, and who are condemned to lead lives of service. According to a writer discussing public education in the Southern Literary Messenger, to enlighten all classes most effectively, we should begin with the upper one first. Light should be set on a high place so that it may dispel the darkness that surrounds us, and a few men truly and thoroughly educated would shed more light around them and awaken a desire for improvement in a greater number than in any other single way in which we could diffuse it. This diffusion, however, did not mean that equality was to be sought. There are many things in which the attempt to introduce the principles of equality must end in the complete deterioration of all parties concerned. God made the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser to rule the night. And this principle was through the whole of creation, and all attempts of man to subvert it must end, as they always have, in the manifest injury to all parties. In the same vein, a writer in Debeau's Review had the following to say about common schools and universities. There are those, I am aware, whose chosen theme it is to declaim upon the democracy of science and literature in this favored age, and to undervalue all education and acquirements unless they be of a popular character. To such I make no reply further than to say, I believe it is self-evident that it is impossible in the nature of things for the multitude to attain more than a very superficial acquaintance with the various departments of learning and knowledge. Not a few thus wished the Southern system of education to be devised in frank recognition of the section's caste system. William H. Trescott of South Carolina expressed this desire in the boldest fashion. In establishing, then, a system of education for a slave state, there are two principles which may be placed as a foundation on which to build: that the state is not required to provide education for the great bulk of the laboring classes, that it is required to afford that degree of education to every one of its white citizens, which will enable him intelligently and actively to control and direct the slave labor of the state. Though the planters of Virginia occasionally made provision for the common school education of the lower orders in their community, it was thus generally thought that higher education was for those whose position in life carried a mandate for public leadership. This led the antebellum South to an anomalous situation in which the facilities for university training were more widespread and better developed than those for secondary school training. Archibald Roane, writing in Debeau's Review, affirmed the Southern choice in this matter. If, then, one of the two systems of education, the common school or the university system, must prevail exclusively, or even generally, and we have already shown that where the former is of the greatest excellence, it does not necessarily follow, the latter too must be so, and that even one may exist without the other. I repeat, if a choice between the two must be made, it seems to me that no man who has regard to the honor, reputation, and glory of his country, abroad and in future time, can hesitate to give preference to the university system. We, in the South at least, who have not been so much carried away by the crude and radical theories of the times, can have no such hesitation. The education which the South envisaged for its upper class was humanistic, and it was so framed as to instill the classic qualities of magnificence, magnanimity, and liberality. The virtues of a ruling caste depend upon the kind of training which molds character. Discussing the proposal to organize a central Southern university at which the sons of the South would be taught the principles of their society, a writer in Debeau's Review set down the following as first consideration. In the organization of the university, this maxim should be borne in mind: nothing is improper to be taught which is proper for a gentleman to learn. While proponents of education talked in general about enlarging the sentiments and developing the powers of the mind, the intimation remained plain that institutions of higher learning were expected to turn out a type, and that the basic aim of instruction was to teach propriety, rather than to cultivate cleverness and ingenuity. This is significant as showing a tendency, for in proportion as a social system is rigid, it will set premium upon conformity to the accepted type, and ignore those whose only birthright is ability. Such education was moral in the sense that it would give the youth a sound set of values. In accordance with the theory of the Greek thinker, it would teach one to approve and disapprove of the right objects in the right manner, or to display a set of correct sentiments determined by the code of the gentleman. In defense of the education of the planter class, a writer in Russell's magazine maintained that, apart from professional exactness and professional details, they have the general scholarly training which so well becomes the gentleman and is so necessary to the perfect development of his character. This was praised as liberal because it resulted in a catholicity of taste as well as of feeling, and an elevated view of all subjects, particularly public affairs. The student, declared a writer in Debeau's review, must be regarded as a moral, as an intellectual, and as a physical being, and any system that does not provide for the proper development of each one of these departments, if the term be permitted, falls short of the requirements of his nature. This presumed a well-rounded regimen which would leave him prepared, like Milton's scholar, to perform all general duties, both public and private, of peace and of war. The significant feature of this training was its avoidance of specialization, that this avoidance was deliberate, and that it derived from the premises there can be no question. Since specialization is illiberal in a freeman, his acquaintance with the arts and sciences must remain that of the amateur. He must learn enough to be a judge of proficiency in others, but proficiency in himself is a sign of vulgarity. Nothing can be clearer than that the men who drew up the program of the southern universities desired to produce neither bookish minds nor clever specialists. They were training young men for the southern world, where scholarship was politely admired and then largely ignored. The students were fully alive to these purposes, and thus we find a youthful orator at the College of William and Mary in 1699 warning his institution against turning out the scholar type. For in such a retired corner of the world, far from business and action, if we make scholars, they are in danger of proving mere scholars, which make a very ridiculous figure, made up of pedantry, disputatiousness, positiveness, and a great many other ill qualities which render them not fit for action and conversation. In 1839, nearly a century and a half later, an article in the Southern Literary Messenger reflected an identical point of view. The writer declared, "Men who are endowed in any extraordinary manner with one talent are generally unfit for any other pursuit in life. They take no interest in the ordinary affairs of society, are lost to all notions of prudence or considerations of the useful. Everything is sacrificed to the indulgence of the one ruling passion. It is well, we say, that society is not made up of such men, but that it consists of those who have no very great capacity for one pursuit more than another, and who possess all the faculties in a moderate degree." King Philip's famous taunt to his son Alexander, who had performed skillfully upon the flute, "Are you not ashamed, son, to play so well?" would have been understood in the antebellum South. The thought of devoting oneself to learning for its own sake did not appeal to the ruling class. Allowing for the great attention paid to the study of law, one may say that Southerners, like the English whom they imitated, wanted at the head of affairs not professionals, but competent amateurs. Training for leadership there was, of course, as has been noted, but when the training has been scrutinized, it turns out to be such as in another age would have produced the courtier, with special attention given to rhetoric. So great was the value set upon the spoken word that, at the University of Georgia, forensic disputation was a required course, and the testimonials proving the Southern College youth's anticipation of a future in politics are numberless. The attitude of the Old South toward education, and in a parallel way toward the arts, cannot be understood until it is realized that the propertied classes regarded their roles in life as fixed, and that academic training was expected to prepare their sons to play their parts as leaders in the little plantation world, or perhaps in the state or national legislature, with skill and credit. That many who entered life without possessions received this training does not diminish the force of the assertion, for they were regarded as, in a sense, probationers, who, in the course of a career of the approved type, would be assimilated into this class. Professionalism and specialization, except in the law, were for those unlucky enough to have to make their living by them. It is axiomatic that in any society, self-made men will imitate those for whom greatness is a birthright. This explains the tremendous pressure to conform to the gentleman type. The sons of yeomen who passed by way of education and success at law into the upper ranks of society, and there were many such, must have felt doubly obligated to accept the point of view of the group in which they were parvenus. The gentleman's ideal of behavior has been in all periods the same. He is a self-justifying type, who feels that he does not have to earn his position by special exertions. That is to say, his importance lies not in what he can do, but in what he is. The gentleman expresses an end in himself, and the display of skills, powers, and cleverness alone does not gain one admission to his circle. These are things needed by those who have not yet arrived in the world, their exhibition a sign that the possessor is still in process of becoming. The gentleman, on the other hand, is heir to the aristocratic knowledge that he owes his place to the structure of society, and not to anything that he can do especially well. There is a persisting belief that to make a man a specialist is somehow to interfere with his performance as a whole man. The career of a gentleman is being a gentleman. The social and educational regimen of the Old South was accordingly such as to prepare the fortunate for public life, to produce men of integrity and decision who could talk well and wear the graces, not quill drivers or career men of letters or explorers of the scientific world. The comparative absence of imaginative literature in the South must be largely explained by the traditional aristocratic contempt for the artist as specialist. The classic expression of this attitude comes from Hotspur, the beau sabreur of a society not unlike that of the antebellum South. I'd rather be a kitten and cry mew than one of these same meter ballad-mongers. In such a milieu, literature is looked upon as an elegant indulgence, pardonable in those who use it as an entertainment for their leisure, reprehensible in those who pursue it to the extent of neglecting personal or public cares. Where war and statecraft are held the chief offices of man, preoccupation with an art will be regarded as a sentimental weakness. The talent which went into the orations of Patrick Henry, the journalism of Madison, the state papers of Jefferson, and the political economy of John Taylor was unquestionably of a high order, but it was confined to one field. The endeavors which elsewhere produced imaginative treatments of the human scene, or, as in New England, theocratic disputes and transcendentalist philosophies, in the South flowered in political classics. Jefferson, the apostle of liberty, after stating the grounds for American independence, wrote a series of state papers and political speculations which may well be regarded as the most seminal in our history. Henry, political seer, predicted in his three most celebrated orations the division of church and state, the separation of the colonies from the mother country, and the then far-off war between the states. Madison, erudite student of history, joined with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay to write the authoritative exposition of the nature of the Union, and John Taylor of Caroline, an unpretending country gentleman, turned like Cincinnatus from the plough to the concerns of his country, and presented the case for agrarian civilization in his formidable An Inquiry into the Principles and Policies of the Government of the United States, a work which one qualified student has described as worthy to rank with the 2 or 3 really historic contributions to political science which have been produced in this country. While the South continued to enjoy the political and social leadership which these denote, while her institutions were yet unchallenged, her literary sterility, though often admitted, was not seriously deplored. In 1820, however, the Missouri Compromise sharply dramatized the growing sectional hostility, and thereafter the South considered it a reproach to herself to remain the literary pupil of the North. Sectionalism in politics had now fully emerged, and it was to be followed by a Southern effort to express a regional culture. From this time on, repeated attempts were made to establish journals which should be vehicles of Southern learning and present the Southern point of view on topics of general interest. The Southern Review of Charleston was the first solid achievement in this direction. and although it attained a standard of real excellence and appears today the most characteristically Southern of all that were attempted, it endured only from 1828 to 1832. 2 years after its cessation, however, a Richmond printer, Thomas Willis White, founded the Southern Literary Messenger, which, despite faltering first steps, was destined to be a mouthpiece of Southern culture for 30 years, and to come nearer than any other medium to giving the Southland that literary independence which was being sought. The first issue of this distinguished journal, appearing in August 1834, carried an editorial which is a summing up of much that has been here pointed out. It is folly to boast of political ascendancy, of moral influence, of professional eminence or unrivaled oratory, when in all the Corinthian graces which adorn the structure of the mind, we are lamentably deficient. It is worse than folly to talk of this ancient and unterrified commonwealth, if we suffer ourselves to be terrified at the idea of supporting one poor periodical devoted to letters and mental improvement. The issue carried also a list of letters from correspondents, saluting its appearance. Their general tone reflects a resentment of Northern intellectual hegemony and a hope that the South would accept the opportunity to express itself on topics other than politics. Said one correspondent, "With these sentiments you may be assured that I wish success to your endeavor to rouse the spirit of the South in the cause of literature, to draw its intellectual energies from the everlasting and monotonous discussion of politics, which has run the same round of arguments and topics for 40 years, and allure her favored sons and daughters to the kinder and brighter fields of science and letters." Another wrote, "I look with much anxiety to your launch, which I wish had been the title of your work, the first of any promise in Virginia, heartily desiring it Godspeed, yet fearing that you may meet with some inaptitude or distaste to mere literary contribution from the educated of our citizens. This, however, cannot last long. You may feel it at the outset, but it will soon end, for I doubt not that the Messenger, as one of its best effects, will draw into literary exercise the talents which now lie fallow throughout the community, or which have long extravasated in politics or professions." A third likewise found reason to hope that it would create an appetite for literary fame and thus diminish the obsession with politics. "We have been too long tributary to the North. It is time, high time, to awake from our lethargy, to rise to the majesty of our intellectual strength, put on the panoply of talents and genius, and strike for the prize of our high calling. If the object of your labors be attained, of which there can be no reasonable doubt, posterity will be more grateful to you than to thousands of political exquisites of the day, whose memory will last only so long as their ephemeral production." Despite a degree of outward success, however, it is plain that the Messenger had to contend with much apathy and indifference in its regional constituency. Thus, in 1853, 9 years after the hopeful beginning just described, one finds the editor exclaiming, "How glad to us will be the day when an ardent love of liberal learning shall have supplanted some of the hobbies of Southern intellect, have roused its slumbering energies and imparted a taste for purest joys and sweetest solaces." By 1857 it appeared that some progress had been made against the universal preoccupation with politics, and the editor could exult in the newfound glory of authors. The literary men are regarded with greater consideration than formerly, and are not now compelled to walk under the huge legs of politicians and peep about to find themselves dishonorable graves. It is getting to be thought that a man may, perhaps, accomplish as much for the South by writing a good book as by making a successful stump speech, that he who contributes to the enjoyment of his fellow citizens by a lofty poem or shapes their convictions by a powerful essay is not an idle dreamer merely, and that the pen, devoted to the treatment of subjects out of the range of political and commercial activities, is as usefully employed as the tongue, which is exercised in the wearisome declamation of legislative halls. Such spells of enthusiasm were usually short-lived, for expectations were dashed. 2 years later, in connection with a pointless debate then going on in Charleston over whether William Gilmore Simms could write good English prose, there appeared this characteristic note of exasperation: "When will the people of the South learn to know and honor their worthiest literary men?" The last of such ventures was Russell's Magazine, which commenced in 1857 under the sponsorship of Timrod, Hayne, and others. An editorial in the second issue reflected the sense of cultural isolation. Year after year, under the influence of foreign pressure and outrage, the southern states have been drawing closer the bonds of a common brotherhood, and developing in self-reliance, energy, courage, and all the resources of independent nationality, they are rapidly aspiring to the station which God designed that they should occupy and adorn. Ironically, at the very time when the South declared its literary independence of the North, Southern authors found it imperative to give a larger share of their intellectual energies to the political struggle. The quarrel over the tariff, the nullification movement, and the beginning of incendiary attacks on slavery put the sections squarely on the defensive, with the result that in the period from 1829 to 1835, the abler leaders of the South definitely abandoned democracy. From this time on, mounting political zeal deflected creative spirits from complete dedication to literature, and also altered for the worse the South's contribution to political thought, heretofore its chief claim to intellectual distinction. The speculations of Henry, Jefferson, Mason, Madison, R.H. Lee, and Taylor may be called philosophic in a real sense of the word. Resting on assumptions furnished by the French Enlightenment, they deal with the broad topic of man in society and discuss principles certain to assert themselves wherever there is free political organization. After the South had been warned to look for destructive attacks on her institutions, both temper and point of view shifted. Her writings became devoted, on the one hand, to an exposition of propositions already crystallized in law, and on the other, to a demonstration of the humanitarian aspects of slavery. The real question was begged. It was now not how might the South best define the legal status of the African for the benefit of the general polity, but what would be the most effective propaganda to counter the stream flowing down from the north. The first question had been uppermost in many minds before hatred clouded the picture, but in the 4 decades preceding the war, dispassionate opinion practically vanished. One is able to appreciate the intensity of the feeling which was generated when he learns that it drove into sectional consciousness such detached and cosmopolitan intelligences as Thomas Jefferson and Edgar Allan Poe. In this connection, John C. Calhoun may be studied as a bridge between the old and the new schools of Southern political thought. Born of up-country yeoman stock, he was of undistinguished origin, but through law and marriage into a family of position he took the sure road to the top of the social hierarchy. Unlike the typical Southerner in his ascetic habits and humorless disposition, Calhoun made a lasting contribution to the political literature of his section, if not indeed to the science of politics, with his doctrine of the concurrent majority, an attempt to fix a procedure whereby in any commonwealth the minority may check the tyranny of the majority. The intellectual resourcefulness indicated by this ingenious theory must place him among the foremost American political thinkers, but at the same time it was so plainly a rationalization of sectional needs that he appears the forerunner of the Southern apologists and his dream of Greek democracy, part of the Southern defensive reaction. This reaction was twofold. It comprised in part an attack on the libertarian dogmas of the French Revolution, and in part a new theory of social articulation. The leading exponents of this theory, who became quite vocal after 1830, reveal a noteworthy unity of belief. Among them was Thomas R. Dew, a Virginian who studied in Germany during the era of Fichte and Hegel and returned home to teach at William and Mary, filled with the notion that duties are more important than rights. Called upon to testify before a legislative committee, he dismissed Jefferson's theories as glittering generalities, stated in substance the iron law of wages, and maintained that all great civilizations are built on the toil of subject peoples. Another was Chancellor William Harper of South Carolina, who in 1837 published A Memoir on Slavery. He took the position that those who control property will always rule, that society has a variety of offices which must be performed by human beings of different castes, and that education should be given in accordance with the recipient's role in life. Is it not palpably nearer the truth, he asked, in an examination of the axiom that all men are created free and equal, to say that no man was ever born free and that no two men were ever born equal? Man is born to subjection, he reasoned, just as he is born in sin and ignorance. Another was Chancellor William Harper of South Carolina, who in 1837 published A Memoir on Slavery. He took the position that those who control property will always rule, that society has a variety of offices which must be performed by human beings of different castes, and that education should be given in accordance with the recipient's role in life. Is it not palpably nearer the truth, he asked in an examination of the axiom that all men are created free and equal? To say that no man was ever born free, and that no two men were ever born equal? Man is born to subjection, he reasoned, just as he is born in sin and ignorance. The most striking contribution to this body of thought, however, was George Fitzhugh's Sociology for the South, published in 1854. This work is unique in the boldness of its attack on the theory of free society and in its remarkable foreshadowing of the modern corporate state. Fitzhugh argued that competitive society throws the burden on the weak and the ignorant, whose toil goes to swell the vulgar pomp and pageantry of ignorant millionaires, and that therefore the entire world should return to slavery, for slavery is a form, and the very best form, of socialism. Private property should be preserved because its possession tends to beget learning, skill, and high moral qualifications. But liberty is a delusion, since all virtue lies in the performance of duty. Though not without misstatements and exaggerations, the book is an outline of the totalitarian state, which substitutes for individual liberty and free competition, a fixed hierarchy and state provision for all classes. And it shows how far out of the main current of 19th century thought the Southern apologists had moved in order to defend their inherited system. An impulse capable of driving political philosophers so far to the right could not fail to be reflected in general literature. The desire of the South for literary fame, never of hardy growth, thrusting up in spite of tendencies of education and social pressure, now had to encounter a gathering political hurricane. We have seen that at the time when the South embarked upon literary independence, it embarked also upon militant sectionalism. If previously the pursuit of belles lettres had been viewed as an amiable frivolity, it might, after the South had commenced its bitter ideological struggle with the North, be regarded as nothing less than remissness in duty. The prevailing notion had always been that a man of parts should serve the state, even in times of peace. Opposed to the effort of a few progressive spirits to win the Southern intellectual away from politics, there must be noted the tendency, strong and pervasive especially among the popular element, to demand of him some form of public service. Thus the gallant Philip Pendleton Cook, circumstanced as few were in his time to cultivate the muse, had the following illuminating incident to report. What do you think of a good friend of mine, a most valuable and worthy and hard-riding one, saying gravely to me a short time ago, "I wouldn't waste time on a damned thing like poetry. You might make yourself, with all your sense and judgment, a useful man in settling neighborhood disputes and difficulties." Cook himself was to some extent tinctured with the same attitude. Literature he regarded as an occupation for the middle years. Thereafter age and gravity called for statecraft. "My literary life opens now," he wrote to a friend. "If the world manifest any disposition to hear my utterances, it will be abundantly gratified. I am 30. Until I am 40, literature shall be my calling, avoiding, however, to rely on it pecuniarily. Then, after 40, politics will be a sequitur." Richard Henry Wilde, whose delicate faculty gave the world "My life is like the summer rose," drew censure for choosing to spend years studying the legend and romance of medieval Italy. "The mission to which Mr. Wilde addressed his faculties and gave years to toil in Europe," wrote a chronicler of the bench and bar of Georgia, "was not in harmony with his relative duties to mankind and with that position which his eminent talents and finished cultivation had secured from the world. He was qualified for extensive practical usefulness as a jurist, scholar, and statesman. In Europe there was delight to the senses, but mildew to the heart. The voluptuary, the man of fashion, the idler were gratified, but the moral hero, the public benefactor, the man of enterprise, and the scholar of a just ambition, desirous to leave a record of popular utility, would turn with generous self-denial from such enchantments." This critic could not understand how Wilde could devote years of study to Tasso, to the sentimental details, to the fantasies of insanity, and that, too, not for the benefit of medical jurisprudence. In short, the task, with whatever success performed by Mr. Wilde, was below the merit which should have sustained itself in a better field. At the Forum, in the walks of political economy, in commerce, in constitutional law, or in the analysis of government, all of which admitted the classic beauties of style. The scholar of a just ambition is an especially meaningful phrase. By it, the writer was pointing to the student of public affairs, whose research and meditation may be counted on to promote the interest of society, not to add to self-culture or to further art for art's sake. As John Donald Wade has remarked, antebellum Georgia considered all activity of the latter kind dilettantism. Occasionally, this attitude took the form of direct patriotic appeal to Southerners of a reflective cast of mind to produce a Southern philosophy. From the Bible and Aristotle, stated a writer in Deboe's review, we can deduce, added to our own successful experiment, quite enough to build a new philosophy on the ruins of the present false and vicious system. The urgency of the time required a Southern transvaluation of values. Hence, it follows that all books in the whole range of moral science, if not written by Southern authors within the last 20 or 30 years, inculcate abolition either directly or indirectly. If written before that time, even by Southern authors, they are likely to be as absurd and dangerous as the Declaration of Independence or the Virginia Bill of Rights. In an environment where insistent denigration of artistic interest was reinforced by overmastering temptation to enter the political debate, there was no room for belles lettres as a profession. Rewards waited upon other forms of activity, and most of those who in the heat and imagination of youth tried poetry and fiction gave them up for good, or for long intervals, either to take up political journalism or to become men of affairs. The gifted man of letters swallowed up in the lawyer is one of the common figures of the Old South. William Wirt, whose Letters of a British Spy and The Old Bachelor reveal a talent for the genial essay, became Attorney General for the United States and gave to office that energy which might have made him conspicuous in literature, as was noted by a contemporary biographer. John Pendleton Kennedy, the friend and benefactor of Poe, after producing in Swallow Barn one of the idols of American literature, a work which for charm and deftness is not surpassed by the best of Irving, closed a long period of dilettante activity by sinking into the complacent functionary and businessman. The career of Nathaniel Beverly Tucker, however, provides perhaps the best example of how Southern men of literary endowment were won from pure literature by the challenge of the sectional political contest. Born at Matoax to a family rich in traditions of service to the state, Tucker graduated from the College of William and Mary, spent a period practicing law in Missouri, and then returned to his alma mater as professor. In 1834 he published George Balcom, a novel described by Poe as the best America had to that time produced. 2 years later appeared The Partisan Leader, a remarkable forecast of sectional conflict, issued under the date 1856, in the hope that it would prove a warning to Virginians. The Partisan Leader is a prime instance of a novel with a specific political purpose. One beholds in this story, with its long disputes over tariffs and other topics of sectional rivalry, the absorbing political strife which was soon to engulf its author completely. A vehement advocate of state rights and the agrarian order, Tucker accepted the gauge which he felt had been thrown down by the North and poured forth a stream of political treatises, but in doing so he silenced one more literary voice for the South. The career of William Gilmore Simms demands special appraisal, for it is peculiarly instructive in the fascination which the Southern social order exercised upon men of strong and independent mind, even while it tormented them with frustration. Simms was the nearest approach to the professional man of letters to be found in the antebellum South, with the possible exceptions of Poe and Mason Locke Weems. Born outside the aristocratic class, he made a determined effort to gain entry into it by means of his pen. And if an indefatigable industry and allegiance to the principles of his society had been a measure of success, he would have reached the top. For several years he deserted romance, in which his achievement had been best recognized, to attempt biography, history, and oratory, securing with his The Morals of Slavery a place alongside Chancellor Harper and Governor J. H. Hammond in pro-slavery arguments. In 1849, he assumed the unrewarding editorship of the Southern Quarterly Review, with the object of giving the South an organ comparable to New England's North American Review. But it was not to be. His considerable exertions in defense of the Southern feudal order did not get him admitted to the magic circle. He discovered that in this milieu, Proficiency in letters, even loyal service to the regime, was no substitute for property holding or family connections. In Charleston, if anywhere, aristocratic disdain for the mere litterateur was decisive, and no conceivable fame in the field of his choice would have been weighed in the scale with the successes of others in camp and senate. Although by some miracle of affection Sims remained a loyal Charlestonian to the end, he could not refrain in moments of despondency from recognizing that celebrated city's indifference to his work. On October 30th, 1858, he wrote in a personal memorandum, "30-odd years have passed, and I can now mournfully say that the old man, his father, was right. All that I have done has been poured to waste in Charleston, which has never smiled on any of my labors, which has steadily ignored my claims, which has disparaged me to the last, has been the last place to give me its adhesion, to which I owe no favor, having never received an office or a compliment or a dollar at her hands, and, with the exception of some dozen of her citizens who have been kind to me, and some scores of her young men who have honored me with loving sympathy and something like reverence, which has always treated me like a public enemy to be sneered at than a dutiful son doing her honor." A passage in his poem, The Western Emigrants, has been taken as reflecting the same feeling. "Simple change of place is seldom exile, as it hath been called but idly. There's a truer banishment to which such faith were gentle. 'Tis to be an exile on the spot where you were born, a stranger to the hearth which saw your youth, banished from hearts to which your heart is turned." This, together with his famous self-composed epitaph, "Here lies one who, after a reasonably long life, distinguished chiefly by unceasing labors, has left all his better work undone," is a poignant testimony of defeat. The tragedy of Sim's entire career was that he expected something which this society was not prepared to give, and that in the struggle he sacrificed too much. As compromises are usually fatal, little doubt exists that the concessions he was compelled to make to be effective as a man account for his relative mediocrity as poet and romancer. The antebellum Southern humorists, who will be remembered as the creators of an indigenous American literature, exhibit the same drift from art to politics. Augustus Baldwin Longstreet, who with Georgia Scenes began the rich tradition of frontier humor, spoke apologetically of his volume as a mere bagatelle and soothed his conscience by hoping that the sketches would one day be valuable as history. Later in life, having gained place and respectability, he plunged into the pro-slavery argument with letters on the Epistle of Paul to Philemon, or the connection of apostolic Christianity with slavery, and A Voice from the South. Joseph Glover Baldwin, a genius at the comic, followed up his entertaining The Flush Times of Alabama and Mississippi, not with more writing of the imaginative kind, which the popularity of this work should have encouraged, but with Party Leaders, a series of political portraits of such men as Hamilton, Jefferson, and Clay. An aristocracy, if it is rich and secure, will foster the arts by means of patronage and largesse, but it does not assimilate the artist. It continues to regard him qua artist. He is, after all, an entertainer. If, on the other hand, the aristocracy is menaced, it will gird itself for battle, and the artist, who in calmer times was its charge, will suffer neglect and perhaps contumely. The dominant society of the Old South was an aristocracy, imperfect but in process of perfecting itself. Its position, however, was remarkably precarious. It was threatened flank and rear. From the north came attack on its labor system, which, as everyone recognized, was the kingpin of the whole Southern economy. From the west came the incessant pressure of the frontier with its natural equalitarianism. Defense against these powerful forces demanded that things be kept in battle order. Ranks had to be closed, allegiance made firm. In the light of these circumstances, one understands why the young Southerner was educated to be a political soldier. He was the heir apparent of a civilization which rested on principles antedating the French Revolution. While New England in her golden day was softening down Calvinism into Unitarianism, the Southern intellectuals were busy building up a rigid theology to defend a social order with which their fortunes stood or fell. The concentration upon this task, which began with academic education, continued with maturity and flowered, as often it did, in a manifesto bearing the fruits of conscientious research and meditation, left little room for the more disinterested kind of creativeness. To many of them, literary aspiration appeared a thing of guilt. Pleasure was there, duty was here. They cultivated literature in odd hours and then left it for sterner employments. Since every system of education is ultimately a tool of the state, the controlling point of view will be that which the state visualizes as its chief source of welfare. In one society it may be commercial skill, in another science and invention. In the Old South it was an ad hoc humanism which produced the gentleman scholar and the political soldier. When one considers this education and this temperament, it comes as no surprise that in the era following Appomattox many Southerners felt impelled to re-enter the Forum. Nearly all of them believed that the various Northern statements of the origin of the war rested not only upon misinterpretations of the Constitutional Compact, a phrase dear to Southerners of legal training, but also upon shallow and sophistical theories of society. It was a matter of proclaiming justice among the ruins, but the powerful polemic vein which had run from Patrick Henry to Calhoun and Yancey continued in appreciable volume for more than 15 years after the collapse of the Confederacy. A later chapter will discuss the pivotal ideas with which the apologists of the lost cause sought at least the consolation of a forensic victory. 4. The older religiousness. Just as there was much in the economic and social structure of the Old South to suggest Europe before the disintegration of the medieval synthesis, so there was much in its religious attitude to recall the period preceding the Age of Reason. For although the South was heavily Protestant, its attitude toward religion was essentially the attitude of orthodoxy. It was a simple acceptance of a body of belief, an innocence of protest and heresy which left religion one of the unquestioned and unquestionable supports of the general settlement under which men live. One might press the matter further and say that it was a doctrinal innocence, for the average Southerner knew little and appears to have cared less about casuistical theology, or the metaphysics underlying all religion. What he recognized was the acknowledgement, the submissiveness of the will, and that general respect for order, natural and institutional, which is piety. A religious solid South preceded the political solid South. Such disputes as occurred among churchmen were ecclesiastical rather than theological, and the laymen themselves preferred not to regard religion as a matter for discussion. Religion was a matter for profession, and after one had professed belief, he became a member of a religious brotherhood. But this did not encourage him to examine the foundations of his creed, or to assail the professions of others. There were quarrels over small points of orthodoxy by the clergy, but a prevailing tendency to take the gospel as handed down prevented the bold speculative flights which gave New England its golden day. The Southerner did not want a reasoned belief, but a satisfying dogma, and the innumerable divisions which occurred on the western frontiers are ascribable to a religious intensity together with an absence of discipline, rather than to a desire to effect a philosophic synthesis, as was elsewhere the case. As early as 1817, the Western Gazetteer, or Emigrants' Directory, made the following report on the condition of religion in Kentucky. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Seceders are the prevailing sects. They manifest a spirit of harmony and liberality toward each other, and, whatever may be said to the contrary, it is a solemn truth that religion is nowhere more respected than in Kentucky. Throughout the South and West there occurred the anomalous condition of an incredible flowering of sects, accompanied by the more primitive type of response to religion. New England, on the other hand, was settled in the early years by people who had been embroiled in religious feuds, which they found occasion for renewing after they had set themselves up in the New World. The doctrinal differences which resulted in the exiling of Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, in the withdrawal of Thomas Hooker from the Bay Colony, and which later cost Jonathan Edwards and Ralph Waldo Emerson their pulpits, are instructive cases in point. Such troubles ensue only when doctrinaires arise to make assent a matter of intellectual conviction. In New England, the forces of dissent finally won the day. The right to criticize and even to reject the dogmas of Christianity became at length more important than the will to believe them, so greatly did the tide run against the conformists. And in the 19th century, Emerson, Channing, and Transcendentalism killed the insistence on uniformity. A conclusion to be drawn from these trends, if one takes the point of view of the older religionists, is that New England, acting out of that intellectual pride which has always characterized her people, allowed religion to become primarily a matter for analysis and debate. Instead of insisting upon a simple grammar of assent, which a proper regard for the mysteries would dictate, they conceived it their duty to explore principles, and when the exploration was complete they came out, not with a secured faith, but with an ethical philosophy, which illuminated much but which had none of the binding power of the older creeds. There followed as characteristic results Unitarianism and Christian Science, two intellectual substitutes for a more rigorous religious faith. The consequences of this divergence did not appear at once, for originally both Virginia and the New England colonies conceived religion as a part of the general program of government. The instructions drawn up for the Virginia Company in 1606 required that the true word and service of God be preached, planted, and used. The First General Assembly, moreover, passed a law ordaining universal church attendance. This, together with various laws against profanation and the sins of the flesh, was enforced with regularity and some severity. Virginia Episcopalians and New England dissenters thus began pari passu in suppressing what they considered alien and subversive views. As time went on, however, their paths separated. The religiousness which in Virginia had originally been supported by laws remained as a crystallized popular sentiment. In New England, always more responsive to impulses from abroad, it gave way to rational inquiry. New Englanders cultivated metaphysics and sharp speculation. Southerners generally, having saved their faith as they thought from the whole group of priors, reformers, and troublesome messiahs, settled back and regarded it as a part of their inheritance, which they did not propose to have disturbed. Such religious persecution as occurred in Virginia found its victims not so often among heretics in theology as among actual or potential disturbers of the peace. The Quakers, who were considered the foremost of these, were treated with extreme hostility throughout the 17th century. The charge leveled against these zealots was not that of doctrinal heresy. It was that their principles tended to undermine the whole institutional character of religion and the state as well. They would not contribute to the support of the established church. They did not hold public assemblies, and they would not bear arms in defense of the Commonwealth. It is little wonder that to colonial administrators these evidences savored of disaffection to the point of disloyalty, and that Quakers were commonly described as a pestilential sect and an unreasonable and turbulent sort of people. The General Assembly of Virginia in the winter of 1659 to 1660 declared that their beliefs tended to destroy religion, laws, communities, and all bonds of civil society, and passed measures which forbade the immigration of Quakers and banished those already in the colony. They were being punished not for the sin of theological schism, but for the crime of political non-cooperation. The history of Unitarianism in the South provides a further commentary on the Southern conception of the role of religion. While the Puritan was attempting to make his religion conform to the canons of logic, conscience, or ethical propriety, the Southerner clung stubbornly to the belief that a certain portion of life must remain inscrutable, and that religion offers the only means of meeting it, since reason cannot here be a standard of interpretation. Unitarianism, as a conspicuously speculative kind of divinity, was agreeable to those who test belief by reason, but unattractive to those who long for a sustaining creed and a means of emotional fulfillment. There were few congregations in the South of sufficiently intellectual disposition to welcome it. Bishop Francis J. Grund explained the situation by saying, "The inhabitants of the South are principally Episcopalians, and as much attached to authority in religion as they are opposed to it in politics. They consider Unitarianism as a religious democracy, because it relies less on the authority of the Scriptures than on the manner in which the authority of the clergy expounds them, and retains too little mysticism in its form of worship to strike the multitude with awe." And James Freeman Clarke found in Kentucky that the nature of the people demanded a more emotional discourse than the typical Unitarian sermon provided. A fairly intensive missionary effort succeeded in establishing Unitarian societies in Augusta, Savannah, Mobile, Nashville, and a few other cities, but most of these dwindled after a brief period of flourishing. As it became plain that the religious radicalism of New England was tending toward anarchy, and more especially as radical clergymen became prominently identified with abolitionism, Southern religious orthodoxy hardened, and the Unitarian societies became powerless to propagate themselves. General evidence that the South afforded poor soil for religious radicalism may be seen in the following distribution of churches. In 1860, this section had one of the 51 Swedenborgian churches in the United States, 20 of the 664 Universalist, and none of the 17 Spiritualist. There was a prevalent feeling among Southern people of cultivation that religion should be a settled affair. Restless and skeptical minds who disputed its grounds were looked upon as persons inimical to a comfortable and orderly design for living. Refuting a point of doctrine brought one a reputation, not so much for intellectual distinction as for perverseness and ill will. New England was contemptuously referred to as the land of notions. A writer in the Southern Literary Messenger, drawing a contrast between Southern and Northern people, found the latter lacking in a sense of measure. Having liberty which they do not appreciate, they run into anarchy. Being devotional, they push piety to the extremes of fanaticism. Being contentious with all, they are led to attack the interests of others, merely because those interests do not comport with their ideas of right. What the aristocratic Southerner desired above all in religion was a fine set of images to contemplate, as Alan Tate has pointed out. The contemplation of such images was in itself a discipline in virtue, which had the effect of building up an inner restraint. And thus a sense of restraint and a willingness to abide by the tradition were universally viewed as marks of the gentleman. On the other hand, the spirit of discontent, of aggressiveness, and of inquisitiveness were associated with those who had something to gain by overturning the established order. In consequence, it is not difficult to see why the Southern gentleman looked upon religion as a great conservative agent and a bulwark of those institutions which served him. Spokesmen of the South were constantly criticizing Northerners for making religion a handmaid of social and political reform. A critic of Dr. W. H. Channing, writing in the Southern Quarterly Review, declared, "It is not very usual for the clergy of our country to enter with zeal upon the arena of politics. The department of a religious teacher is supposed to lie in a different sphere and to embrace different duties, and the people generally listen to him with aversion and reluctance when he meddles with secular subjects." A dozen years later, a writer in the Southern Literary Messenger thus described the mixing of secular and religious causes by the North. Her priesthood prostitutes itself to the level with a blackguard and enters the secular field of politics in the spirit of a beerhouse bully, and the politician as carelessly invades the sanctuary of the priest. Although Southern clergymen not infrequently invoked the word of God to defend Southern institutions, especially when these were being assailed, they were on principle opposed to the use of the Church as a tool for worldly reform. The evangelical sects aimed at the conversion of the inner man, the conservative ones at the exposition of a revealed ethic, but both regarded themselves as custodians of the mysteries, little concerned with political agitation and out of reach of the winds of political doctrine. Reverence for the Word of God is a highly important aspect of Southern religious orthodoxy. Modern discussions of fundamentalism usually overlook the fact that belief in a revealed knowledge is the essence of religion in its older sense. The necessity of having some form of knowledge that will stand above the welter of earthly change and bear witness that God is superior to accident led Thomas Aquinas to establish his famous dichotomy, which teaches that, whereas some things may be learned through investigation and the exercise of the reasoning powers, others must be given or revealed by God. Man cannot live under a settled dispensation if the postulates of his existence must be continually revised in accordance with knowledge furnished by a nature filled with contingencies. Nature is a vast unknown. In the science of nature, there are constantly appearing emergents which, if allowed to affect spiritual and moral verities, would destroy them by rendering them dubious, tentative, and conflicting. It is therefore imperative in the eyes of the older religionists that man have for guidance in this life a body of knowledge to which the facts of natural discovery are either subordinate or irrelevant. This body is the rock of ages, firm in the vast sea of human passion and fallibility. Moral truth is not something which can be altered every time science widens its field of induction. If moral philosophy must wait upon natural philosophy, all moral judgments become temporary, relative, and lacking in those sanctions which alone make them effective, as the more perspicacious Southern theologians pointed out. And though possibly no people were more ignorant of the Summa Theologica than the little read and inarticulate southern rural population, the dualism of Aquinas supports their instinctive opposition to scientific monism, one of the last of the South's medieval heritages. Both are responses to the same need. Ill-equipped intellectually, the South established a habit of being right in the wrong way, or correct with a poor set of reasons. Then, as now, this heritage explains its dogged adherence to what is taught in the book, and its indifference to empirical disproofs. Emerson and his colleagues founded their revolt against New England orthodoxy upon the principle of the continuity of knowledge and the prerogative of the individual mind to judge and determine. They were successful, and the country concluded that the victory was won everywhere. But in the South, the battle has not yet been fought. In the present century, when publicity attending the theory of evolution forced the issue, there was widespread amazement that legislatures representing sovereign states were prepared to vote revealed knowledge precedence over natural, for such, in a broad view of the matter, is the significance of the so-called anti-evolution laws. This could not have surprised anyone who knew the tradition, for here there had never been any impeachment of the word, and science had not usurped the seats of the prophets. It may therefore be proper to describe the South as backward, if one employs the word not in some vaguely prejudicial sense, but with reference to the continuum of history. The South was striving to preserve a centuries-old distinction which the North was condemning as error. Indeed, it has been a settled practice with Southern spokesmen to describe the differences between North and South in religious language. When the period of sectional separation came, more than one Southern churchman could be found placing the blame for the sin of New England, the chief of which was abolitionism, upon the great Socinian heresy. This was bidding open defiance to the whole movement of deism and rationalism, which by the middle of the 18th century had captured the cultivated orders of Europe, and by the middle of the next much of New England and the North. At the height of the Gilded Age, the Reverend R.L. Dabney, a celebrated Southern Presbyterian divine, was pronouncing pragmatism the equivalent of atheism, and fundamentalist leaders today regard the purely scientific view of man as only the modern pose of godlessness. It cannot be denied that during the period of the French Revolution there was much religious skepticism in certain Southern educational centers and among elements of the Southern upper class. It was, however, a transient phase, confined while it lasted to small cultivated groups, and it disappeared so completely in the antebellum years that it can be properly ignored in any account of the molding of the Confederate South. Skepticism is always the achievement of an intellectual aristocracy, who by education and through access to libraries have become accustomed to the critical handling of ideas. At the close of the 18th century, and for perhaps 2 decades afterward, some Southern aristocrats considered it fashionable to embrace deism and to flaunt a disrespect for the Bible. Jefferson, who in this period translated 20 chapters of Volney's Ruins, is of course the best-known Southern exponent of free thinking. The irreligion of the day turned Williamsburg, home of Venerable William and Mary College, into a veritable seat of infidelity. It flourished surprisingly at the University of North Carolina. It crept across the mountains and infected illustrious Transylvania in the bluegrass region of Kentucky, and it penetrated the University of Georgia, then in its early years. Despite such progress, however, it remained distinctly an upper-class attitude, sharply localized, and without power to affect the essential religiousness of the Southern populace. After 1830, when the South, as if by prescience, turned to a defense of all conservative ideals, it declined almost to the point of extinction. One might suppose that the powerful example of Jefferson would have started a school of rationalism below the Potomac, but in this matter, as in others, Jefferson failed to take root in his section. His doctrine of state rights and his agrarianism were cherished, but his religious liberalism, like most else that he learned from the French radicals, was ignored. His influence waned rapidly, so that within a few years after his death the Presbyterians were able to force the resignation of an atheist professor from the University of Virginia, which Jefferson had hoped to make the very citadel of unfettered thought. In the same period, South Carolina fundamentalists compelled the removal of President Cooper of the State University because he had questioned the authority of the Pentateuch. The influence of 19th-century science upon the religious temper of the Old South was never great. It has been the prevailing view that Southerners devoted their minds to politics, the classics, and the novels of Sir Walter Scott, remaining blandly innocent of the discoveries in which this century was so fruitful. Like other generalized descriptions, this one is effectually true, but omits some details which would qualify the picture. Thomas Carey Johnson, in a survey of scientific activity in the antebellum South, has corrected a number of overstatements of Southern indifference to the spirit of the age. He found natural science taught not only in colleges, where sometimes it led the list of elective subjects, but even in female seminaries, and he names a number of Southerners who proved themselves fertile in theory and invention. His study, however, affords little if any evidence that this scientific interest, more widespread than is popularly supposed, issued in a skeptical habit of mind. The truth seems clear that the Southern scientist did not carry his scientific speculation to the point at which it becomes an interpretation of the whole of life. This author ascribes the failure of the South to become eminent in scientific thought to the individualism of its people and their unwillingness to cooperate in enterprises. It seems more accurate to say, on the contrary, that although the traditional mind of the South recognized in science a fascinating set of means, it refused to become absorbed to the extent of making it a religion. Unlike the technician of the present day, the typical Southerner did not feel that he must do a thing because he found that he could do it. It is significant that neither the Jacobinism of the French Revolution nor the scientific materialism of the century which followed was able to draw him from the view that man holds a central position in the universe under divine guidance. In this way, the Southern people reached the eve of the Civil War almost untouched by the great currents of rationalism and skepticism, and their allegiance to the older religiousness was reflected in their fighting men. Into the strange personnel of the Confederate Army, out of regions that sat in darkness, poured fighting bishops and prayer-holding generals, and through it swept waves of intense religious enthusiasm long lost to history. And when that army went down to defeat, the last barrier to the secular spirit of science, materialism, and democracy was vanquished. It seems an inescapable inference that, in the sphere of religion, the Southerner has never been friendly to the spirit of inquiry. He felt, with what may now appear prophetic instinct, that a religion which is intellectual only is no religion. In contrast to his cousin in the north, he has been willing to accept the mystery. Traditionally, his has been a natural piety, expressing itself in uncritical belief and in the experience of conversion, not in an ambition to perfect a system, or to tidy up a world doomed to remain forever deceptive, changeful, and evil. For him, a moral science made up of postulates and deductions, taking no cognizance of the inscrutable designs of Providence and the ineluctable tragedies of private lives, was no substitute. Whether he was a Virginia Episcopalian, dozing in comfortable dogmatic slumber, or a Celt, transplanted to the Appalachian wilderness and responding to the wild emotionalism of the religious rally. He wanted the older religiousness of dreams and drunkenness, something akin to the rituals of the medieval church and to the Eleusinian mysteries of the ancients.